The waiter said, "This table is reserved," and as the young man began to rise from his chair, glancing across the half-empty dining room, counting the white tablecloths draped over tables that held nothing but folded napkins and unlit candles, the man sitting 12 feet away set down his bourbon glass, pushed back his chair, and stood up. That sound, the slow scrape of heavy wood across Chason's hardwood floor, cut through the low murmur of the dining room like a needle dragged across a record. Wait, because the single sentence Dean Martin said when he reached that table didn't just silence the room. It's the reason this story has been told quietly, in dressing rooms and on studio lots, for 60 years, and almost nobody outside of Hollywood has ever heard it. The year was 1965. Hollywood was still a company town, which meant it had company rules, and the most important of those rules was one nobody wrote down, and everybody understood. Certain places were for certain people. Not by law anymore, not since 11 years earlier when the Supreme Court had ruled on the matter, but the law and the room are two different things. And in 1965, in the private dining rooms and preferred tables of Beverly Hills and West Hollywood, the room still had its own jurisdiction. Chason's restaurant on Beverly Boulevard was as close to a private club as Los Angeles had to offer. Dark paneled walls, white tablecloths so stiff they could stand on their own, silverware heavy enough to feel like an investment. The kind of place where your reservation didn't just hold a table, it announced that you belonged to a certain world. Frank Sinatra had a preferred booth. Elizabeth Taylor had celebrated her birthdays there, and Dean Martin, on nights when he wasn't performing or recording or sitting in some other famous room being Dean Martin, came to Chason's for the steak and the quiet. He'd arrived that evening at 7 o'clock, alone, which was unusual. Dean almost always had people around him, friends, musicians, the easy orbit of men who liked to laugh and didn't take anything too seriously. But tonight, he'd told his driver to drop him and come back at 9. Walked in without announcing himself, ordered his usual New York strip, medium rare, bourbon neat, and settled into his chair with the particular relief of a man who has been performing for other people all day and finally gets to stop. He was in the middle of a television production schedule that would have worn out a man 10 years younger. Tapings, rehearsals, guest coordination, wardrobe fittings. The Dean Martin show demanded a version of him that was always on, always smooth, always effortlessly funny. He was good at it. He was in fact so good at it that people sometimes forgot it was work. Dean never forgot. He'd ordered his bourbon and was thinking about nothing in particular. The way you think when you're genuinely tired and the silence of a good restaurant is the only thing you wanted. When the door opened and a young man walked in. Notice the way he moved, because it tells you everything. He didn't swagger. He didn't hesitate either. Not entirely. He walked the way a person walks, when they've argued with themselves for 2 weeks about whether to do something and finally decided to stop arguing. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes taking in the room with the careful attention of someone who knows they might need to remember every detail of it later. He was 22 years old. Lean in a way that suggested he didn't always eat 3 meals a day, wearing a jacket that fit him the way borrowed clothes fit, almost right, but not quite. His tie was straight. That detail mattered to him. You could see it in the slight self-conscious way his hand moved toward it before he caught himself and let it drop. His name was Marcus Webb. He'd grown up in South Los Angeles, where the movie theater was the one reliable portal to a different world. He'd sat in the front rows and watched men on screen move through life with a certainty that seemed almost impossible from where he was sitting. He'd watched Dean Martin specifically, the way Dean held a room, the way a joke landed, the way a song could make 200 strangers feel like they were all in on the same secret. Marcus had decided somewhere around 16 that he wanted something in that world, something that required you to be so completely yourself that other people felt it. He'd gotten to Hollywood the way most people do, stubbornly, with bad timing, and on almost no money. He'd landed work as a set laborer on the Paramount lot. Early mornings, physical labor, the invisible infrastructure of filmmaking nobody thinks about when watching the finished product. But he was there, on the lot, watching the industry from its edges. 3 weeks before the night at Chason's, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, the sky over the Paramount lot had opened without warning. One of those Los Angeles rainstorms that arrives like an afterthought, and within 4 minutes has turned every studio street into a shallow river. Marcus had been crossing the lot with a clipboard and an assignment he'd already completed when the rain hit. He ducked under an overhang, shook the water from his hair, and looked out at the downpour. That's when he saw Dean Martin. Dean was walking from stage 18 toward the parking area, head slightly bowed against the rain, hands in the pockets of a jacket that was not designed for weather. He was moving fast, the way a man moves when he's made his peace with getting wet and just wants to be done with it. He was alone. No assistant, no driver waiting with an umbrella. Just Dean Martin in the rain, looking for a moment like anyone else. Marcus didn't think about it. That was the thing he'd remember later, the absence of deliberation. He just moved. He grabbed the umbrella he kept folded in his back pocket, a cheap telescoping thing he'd bought for $1.50 at a drugstore, snapped it open, and ran out into the rain. He caught up to Dean in 6 strides and held the umbrella over the man's head, which meant Marcus himself was standing in the rain, getting soaked from the shoulders outward, water running down his neck into his collar. Dean Martin stopped walking and looked at him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The rain hammered the umbrella between them. Dean's expression moved through something, surprise, then assessment, then something warmer that didn't quite have a name. "I got you, Mr. Martin," Marcus said. Dean looked at him for another second, then started walking again, and Marcus walked beside him, holding the umbrella steady. They covered maybe 40 feet together, to the place where Dean's car was waiting. Dean stopped, turned, looked at the young man who was now thoroughly wet, while Dean himself was relatively dry. "What's your name?" "Marcus, sir. Marcus Webb." "You work here, Marcus?" "Yes, sir. Set labor, mostly. Stage 12 right now." Dean nodded slowly. He had a way of looking at people, not the performer's look that swept a room, but a quieter, more direct attention. He studied Marcus for a moment, the soaked jacket, the steady eyes, the umbrella still held at the precise angle to keep Dean dry, even though the car was right there. "Appreciate it, son," Dean said. He got in the car. The window came down. "Stay dry, Marcus." He drove off. Marcus stood in the rain for a full minute after the car disappeared, holding the umbrella over his own head. Now, thinking about the fact that Dean Martin had just said his name. Not a big moment by any measurable standard, not a conversation, not a connection, not an opportunity. Just a name spoken by a man who an hour from now almost certainly wouldn't remember the face that went with it. Marcus knew this. He was 22, not 12. He understood how the world worked, but he stood there another 30 seconds anyway. 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb had his first real paycheck in the inside pocket of his jacket, $48, minus what he'd already sent home to his mother, minus rent, left him with $19 and change. He knew exactly what he wanted to do with it. He'd been thinking about it since he cashed the check. He'd heard about Chason's the way everyone in Hollywood heard about Chason's, slowly, in pieces, from people who'd either been there or knew someone who had. The chili was famous. The steaks were famous. The booths where the names of Hollywood sat and ate and made decisions were famous. Marcus knew he had no business going there. He was a 22-year-old set laborer with $19 in his pocket and a borrowed tie. He knew the unwritten rules, the ones that don't appear in any policy because they don't need to. He'd been navigating those rules since he was old enough to understand they existed. But he'd been thinking about this for 3 weeks, and he was tired of the thinking. He wanted to sit down in a good restaurant, order a steak, and feel, for one evening, like a man who had earned something. He arrived at 7:15, stood on the sidewalk for 2 full minutes, looking through the window at the candlelight and the white tablecloths and the careful choreography of a serious restaurant operating at its evening pace. His heart was doing something uncomfortable. He straightened his tie, the borrowed one, the only one, and pushed the door open. The host's stand was momentarily unattended. The host had stepped away for perhaps 90 seconds to handle something in the back. 90 seconds was enough. Marcus walked into the dining room. The room was perhaps half full. Quiet conversations, the soft percussion of silverware, the smell of grilled meat, and something expensive he couldn't identify. He saw an empty table near the wall. 2 chairs, white tablecloth, a small candle. He crossed the room and sat down. He placed both hands flat on the tablecloth and held them there, felt the weight of the silverware, looked at the room. For approximately 90 seconds, he simply sat in a place where he had been told, in every way except words, that he didn't belong. And in those 90 seconds he breathed and looked around and felt something he wouldn't be able to name until years later, the specific, quiet dignity of refusing to accept someone else's definition of where you're allowed to exist. What Marcus didn't know was that Dean Martin was sitting 12 feet behind him. Dean had arrived 20 minutes earlier, had his bourbon in front of him, and was waiting for his steak. He wasn't thinking about the lot or the tapings or any of it. He was just sitting, in the way that truly tired people sit, present but not performing, eyes soft, mind somewhere comfortable and undemanding. Then he saw the young man come in. It took him a moment. The dining room wasn't bright, and the kid was sitting with his back, mostly turned, but something about the posture, shoulders back, deliberate, the posture of a person who has decided something, pulled at Dean's attention. He watched, and then the kid shifted slightly, and Dean saw the profile, and then he knew, the umbrella, the rain, the paramount. He set down his bourbon. The waiter reached the table, a man in his mid-40s, thin mustache, white jacket, the professional neutrality of someone who has learned to make his face unreadable. He approached Marcus's table, and his expression did something small and almost invisible, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional reset of the professional smile. "Good evening, sir. I'm afraid this table is reserved." Marcus looked up. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. Is there another table available?" The waiter's gaze moved across the room, a performance of consideration, brief and unconvincing. "I'm afraid we're fully committed this evening, sir." Marcus looked at the room. He could see, without turning his head, at least 4 empty tables. The candles on them hadn't even been lit, which meant they hadn't been expected to be used tonight. He understood what was happening. He'd understood since the waiter's expression did its small, almost invisible thing. He'd been understanding this particular thing since he was 9 years old. "I understand," Marcus said quietly. He began to stand. The waiter took a small step back, clearing the path. Dean Martin was already moving. He didn't hurry. That was the thing the waiter would think about later, lying awake. Dean Martin did not rush. He pushed his chair back with that sound, the deliberate, unhurried scrape of heavy wood that made half the dining room look up, and he stood and he walked, 12 feet, at the pace of a man who has decided something and is in no hurry to announce it because the decision is already made. Every head in the restaurant turned, not because Dean Martin was famous, though he was, because there is something in the way a person moves when they are entirely certain of what they're doing that compels attention the way gravity compels attention. It simply pulls. He reached Marcus's table. Marcus had frozen halfway out of his chair. He was looking up at Dean Martin, and his face was doing several things at once. Recognition, confusion, the particular suspended quality of a moment that the brain knows is significant before it understands why. Dean pulled out the chair across from Marcus, sat down, settled in, adjusted the napkin on his lap with the casual thoroughness of a man taking his regular seat. He looked at the waiter. The waiter had gone, the specific color of a person whose professional life is rearranging itself in real time. "Funny thing," Dean said. His voice was easy, conversational, the voice of a man who finds the situation mildly interesting rather than charged. "This table is reserved. I reserved it." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "Guess I forgot to mention it when I came in." The waiter's mouth opened, closed, closed. The room was quiet enough that the candles were audible. Dean turned to Marcus. Marcus was gripping the edge of the tablecloth with both hands. His jaw was set in the particular way of someone who has decided they will not let anything show, and is succeeding. "Mostly. You're the kid from the lot," Dean said. "The rain." Marcus nodded. He didn't trust his voice yet. "You got soaked." "It dried," Marcus said. Dean Martin smiled. Not the stage smile, not the television smile, not the smile that sold cigarettes and movie tickets and albums, a smaller, quieter thing. The smile of a man who has just heard exactly the right answer. He turned back to the waiter. "The steak I ordered at my table. Bring it here, and bring another one for my friend. Same cut, medium rare." He considered, for a moment, "and another bourbon, whatever he's drinking." "Coca-Cola," Marcus said. "Coca-Cola," Dean repeated, as if this were a completely reasonable development. The waiter disappeared. He moved with the specific velocity of a man who is grateful to have somewhere to go. Dean leaned back in his chair and looked at Marcus with the same direct, unhurried attention he'd used on the Paramount lot in the rain. "Relax," he said. "We're just having dinner." Marcus exhaled. It came out more like a long, slow release of something he'd been holding since he walked in the door. Maybe since he stood on the sidewalk outside for 2 minutes, arguing with himself. "Mr. Martin," he started. "Dean." Marcus looked at him. "Nobody calls me Mr. Martin, except people who want something from me," Dean said. "You already gave me something. We're past that." They ate 2 New York strips. Medium rare. Dean's bourbon, Marcus's Coca-Cola. The dining room around them gradually resumed its business. The conversations, the silverware, the careful performance of a room pretending not to watch something it was absolutely watching. Dean asked Marcus where he was from. South Los Angeles. He asked how he'd gotten to Hollywood. Marcus told him. The stubbornness, the bad timing, the not quite enough money, the belief that if he could get close enough to the thing he wanted, something would eventually happen. Dean listened in the way that people who are genuinely interested listen, which is different from the way people listen when they're waiting for their turn to speak. He asked about the theater on Crenshaw. Marcus told him about the front rows, the westerns, the musicals, watching people on screen move through the world like they had a right to take up space. "What do you want to do?" Dean asked. "Not on the lot. In it." Marcus thought about this. "Act," he said. "Maybe direct someday. I don't know yet. I just know I want to be inside it, not carrying things around the outside of it." "You have any training?" "No. Can't afford classes." Marcus looked down at his plate for a moment. "I watch, I pay attention. I try to understand what makes something work." Dean cut his steak. "That's how I started. Nobody handed me a method. I watched how a room worked. I watched what made people laugh and what made them stop. I figured out what I had that nobody else had, and I used it until it became something." He took a bite, chewed, considered. "The watching is the training. Most people don't know that." "Do you think I can make it?" Marcus asked. He said it the way you ask a question when you've been not asking it for a long time, quickly, before you can decide not to. Dean looked at him for a long moment, not the performer's assessment, not the industry appraisal of potential and marketability. Something older than that, the look of a barber's son from Ohio who understood from the inside what it cost to walk into a room where the unspoken message was that you didn't belong and sit down anyway. "You walked into this restaurant tonight," Dean said. "You knew exactly what might happen. You'd been standing outside for a couple of minutes before you came in. I could tell from the way you moved when you sat down, you'd already had the argument with yourself and decided, that's a thing you either have or you don't." He picked up his bourbon. "I think you have it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for all of this." "Don't thank me for the steak," Dean said. "Thank me when you get your first speaking role." They talked for another hour about the industry, the parts that worked and the parts that ate people alive, if you weren't careful, about the difference between talent and stamina, and why stamina mattered more in the long run, about what it meant to have a thing that was genuinely yours versus a thing you'd borrowed from someone you admired. Dean told him to find an acting class, even a cheap one, even one class a week. Told him to get there early every single time. Told him that the invisible work, the showing up, the being reliable, the giving people no reason to doubt you, was the foundation that everything else stood on. Listen carefully, because this is easy to miss. Dean Martin didn't give Marcus a job. He didn't make a call or write a name on a napkin. He didn't open a door. He sat across a table from a young man who had held an umbrella in the rain and treated him like someone whose time and presence mattered. In 1965, in that dining room, in those specific circumstances, that was not a small thing. When the check came, Dean picked it up without looking at it, put cash on the table without counting it, and stood. Marcus stood too. He held out his hand. Dean shook it. "Thank you," Marcus said again, "for the steak." Dean held the handshake one extra beat. "I told you, don't thank me for the steak." He walked out of Chason's alone, paused briefly on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking up at the Beverly Boulevard sky. Then he got in his car, and his driver took him home. He didn't tell anyone about the dinner that night. Not his manager, not his friends, not the people who traveled in his orbit and would have found the story charming and worth repeating. He didn't tell the story because it wasn't, in his understanding of it, a story, it was dinner. It was the correct thing to do, and he'd done it, and that was the whole of the matter. Stop for a moment and think about what kind of person that requires you to be. Not the public version, not the tuxedo and the tumbler and the television show. The private version, the one that exists when nobody is watching and there's nothing to gain. Dean Martin could have finished his steak and looked away. He could have noted the injustice the way comfortable people note injustices, with a slight tightening of the jaw and a return to their bourbon. He could have done what most people in that room did, which was to look and then to not look, because looking requires you to do something and not looking is so much easier. He got up instead. He got up instead. Here's what people forget about Dean Martin. The image was real in the sense that all good performances are real. It came from something true. Dean was genuinely funny, genuinely warm, genuinely inclined to make the people around him comfortable and laughing. But images are partial. They show you what the light catches and leave everything else in shadow. What the image didn't fully show was the thing underneath the ease. A man who had grown up with enough and not enough in equal measure, who understood what it felt like to be evaluated by the wrong criteria, who had learned that the only sustainable way to move through a world full of small cruelties was to refuse, quietly and consistently, to participate in them. Marcus Webb got his first speaking role 14 months after that dinner. 3 lines in a television drama. Nothing that made anyone's career, but he was there, on set, in the shot, speaking words that would be recorded and broadcast. He thought about Dean Martin when he got the call, and then he thought about not thanking him for the steak, and then he laughed to himself in the parking lot of his apartment building before going inside. He never spoke to Dean Martin again. Some things are complete in themselves. What Marcus carried forward was not a connection or a contact or any of the currency Hollywood ran on. It was the memory of a specific evening when a man who had every reason to stay in his seat got up anyway, walked 12 feet and sat down, and said, without saying it, that Marcus Webb's presence in a room mattered. That kind of thing changes a person. Not overnight, but it works on you slowly. The way the best things do, you carry it into rooms. You find yourself, years later, getting up from your own chair for someone else, and you remember where you learned that it was possible. The restaurant on Beverly Boulevard closed in 1995. Most of the people who were in that dining room that evening are gone. The story traveled the way these stories travel, quietly, indirectly, through people who were there and told someone who told someone else. What remains is this. On a Tuesday night in 1965, Dean Martin was tired and alone, and eating a steak he'd earned, and he could have stayed in his seat. He didn't. One look at a young man rising with his dignity intact from a table that was never actually reserved. One breath, maybe. One choice, made in the time it takes to push back a chair. The sound of that chair on the hardwood floor, that slow, deliberate, unhurried scrape, that's the part the people in the room never forgot. Not the conversation, not the steak, not even the look on the waiter's face. The sound of a man deciding to get up. It cut through the room like the first note of a song you didn't know you'd been waiting to hear. If you want to know what Dean Martin was really like, not the character, not the act, not the image that's been replayed and referenced and imitated for 60 years, that sound is as close as anything gets. The chair, the 12 feet, the sitting down, the steak, the hour of real conversation. The check paid without ceremony, and the handshake held one beat longer than necessary. And then the car and the drive home. And nobody told the story that night, because it wasn't, to the man who had lived it, a story worth telling. It was just what you did. It was just Tuesday. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps, more than you'd think. And if there's a night you want to hear about, a room Dean walked into that changed more than just his evening, leave it in the comments. There are more of these stories, and some of them are even quieter than this one, and somehow those are always the ones that stay with you the longest.